What's up, future shredlords? Welcome back. Down to the fingers. Got a very simple lesson today, how to spice up and sort of expand the idea of power chords. What I call Vi-isms. When I was a kid, I was amazed at guys like Van Halen and Steve Vai and countless other guitar players. Obviously, they could really sort of spice up their playing. And then you have like this whole other group over here, the Warren DeMartinis and the George Lynches and stuff, and they do it in a slightly different way. So we're going to look at both of those ideas today. It's pretty simple. It's based around caged and power chords and some interval theory. Nothing major. So grab the axe. You know the drill. Let's do this. All right, the slightly easier version of this idea of sort of enhancing the power chord starts with just using intervals. Now, this is used all over the place in 80s music, like especially the metals realm, but it's in classic rock, it's in pop rock, it's everywhere. So this is not something that you can exactly skip over. And how good you are at this stuff is actually going to dictate how good you can get with the next stuff, because we're just going to take this stuff and make it more complex. Right. So obviously step number one is just recognizing the intervals. So if I'm working in A here, 5th fret. Now listen, I'm going to say this. You can kind of exclude seconds and sevenths, okay, 2 and 7 as intervals for right now, because it's pretty saucy and it's not for everybody. So it takes a while to sort of work up to that level. But thirds, fourths, fifths, and sixths are important. And remember, fourths and fifths are perfect. So you can either augment or diminish them, right? Which gives you the tritone. And you also have major and minor versions of the thirds and sixths, right? So if I'm starting in A, if I play 3 and 5, or 5 and 3, I should say, low E and A string, right? I get that minor third. Moving up here to the C sharp, the major, right? Bard gives me the fourth. Of course, the classic power chord. There's the minor sixth. There's the major sixth. Minor seventh there. So you're starting to get into some really extreme territory, if you will. But that's got to be step number one, is just being able to play those intervals. And then, of course, essentially calling them out and knowing what they sound like. You should know that that's a fourth. Right? Or this. That's a fifth, right? So if you're like, oh, okay. Those are sixths, right? So I think too many people just try to jump ahead and be like, oh, I'll just memorize these fingerings. You got to put a face to the name. So don't really skip over that. The next big one is obviously using those intervals in a diatonic scale. Right, so using the key of G major now, if I was doing thirds, right? Starting off the major, then minor, minor, major, major, minor, minor, major, right? If I'm doing the sixths, it's going to be the same thing. I'm going to have this major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, minor, and major again, right? If I'm doing fourths, in this case, we have to watch the fourth degree here, because now I'm going to get this tritone configuration, right? So I've got this stacked on top of each other till I get here. There's my sort of diminished flavor, if you will. That's where that comes from. And I can keep going up. And when you're doing fifths, it happens here down at the, at the 7th degree. Because if you look at the scale, right? There is no note here, right? So obviously I can't do a fifth. I have to then diminish that or whatever, augment it, however you want to see that. But essentially you get this tritone configuration, and that's a big one, because now you're starting to see the theoretical perspective of where these chords come from. They're not just random. And that's a big clue right there. You're like, okay, I got a 5 here, a 5 here, a 5 here, here, and except for that's not going to be a 5. That's going to be the tritone in fourth. So you'd be like, it's there kind of deal. So when you're starting to build chord progressions and whatnot, by memorizing where some of these key alterations are, you can use those to your advantage. Right now, it doesn't sound so great because we're just kind of doing the low level theory stuff, but once you get good enough at it, you start to recognize this. You can use it incredibly effectively in a real world playing situation. And believe you me, those intervals end up being the building blocks for like a huge amount of knowledge that you're going to apply later on when you get a lot more skill. True story, right? So that's the whole idea between the diatonic sort of relationship with these intervals. Not only do the intervals themselves have like, you know, you can apply some sort of basic music theory, turn a major into a minor, right? But I can also now essentially start stacking them, moving up in a major scale, or as the minor, as the Mixolydian mode, as Aeolian, because it's just a rearranging of the major scale, right? Done deal. So once I get that far, now what I want to do is add a new element, which is a pedal tone. And I'm just going to use that so I can basically work on combining two sets of intervals together. So in this case, might as well use the classic E here, or let's do it in D. Why not? There's about 16 Rat songs and a whole bunch of other 80s metal right there. Essentially, all I'm doing is moving from the power chord to this tritone configuration, okay? And I could have kept going, right? And you keep going, and you know, like there's a whole bunch you can do there. You can sort of string chords together. Right, so that's me using the E, the D, the C, and the B here with this E, obviously, all in the key of, well, we could say it's G major, if you will, E minor. But the key here is obviously there's like a relationship. When I did the first one here, those all work good. I could also use this one too. This gives you more like the Dio feel. When you're sort of playing in unison here like this, you get that sort of like more Phrygian or maybe even Locrian kind of feel. It's more Phrygian to me because it's got that sort of Middle Eastern darker sound, if you will. So, I mean, obviously that's a huge advantage. But notice when you go down here to the D, got more of that party rock sort of Van Halen feel, right? If I move down again to the C, again, that's similar to when I'm doing it at the E here, but when I go down that extra step, I'm really adding in a lot of tension, right? So I might use that as a transitionary idea, right? Like I'm moving from the power chord to create, because I'm going, recycling that basic sort of movement of the top two notes there, but with two different chords, right? So in this case, and then I get obviously the minor 6 here, moving to that. And of course, by adding in the low E there, of course, I'm going to get a really great sound, right? And again, you can hear that too when the E is paired up with each one of these power chords, right? So that's another big one. Again, all using the diatonic scale, right? If we were talking about, that's going to be the E over the E minor Aeolian position, right? Then moving down to Mixolydian here, the 5th degree. 4, 3, 2, 1, and 6 again, right? So again, once you start to really just use the basic theory to be like, where am I? You're going to know. And another great tip here before I wrap this little part up here is essentially using the notes of a scale to sort of tell you what the interval structure is going to be. So if I start down here in the G, I've got, right? And of course I've got this Locrian position just below it, right? So I can be like, there's this one here. I've got that 6th there. I've got this 3rd. I've got the 4th, right? And you can keep going. You've got the octave here. Of course, you've got the 6th there, which is the same as this one, just me doing it across, 2 strings instead of, or I mean, the low E and the D string, sorry, rather than the low E and the A string. So I think you're getting the message here, right? You can then use that if you're like, oh, look, I'm moving up here. The the next one obviously has to be up here, right? And there's the basis for a lot of the blues stuff that you've heard many times, right? Right, again, using this idea of intervals and sort of pairing that up with the power chord. The power chord itself is the main piece of the, you know, the ingredient, if you will. And later on, you should be like, well, I've got this E-type chord here. So I've got this power chord right here. I've got the A-type chord. I've got this one right here. And of course, if you just do it one more time, you can get it on the D string. It looks a little different. But, you know, it's all good. And of course, you're like, okay. There's Poison, right? Fallen Angel. Whatever it is, right? I'd have to actually sync it up so I could maybe use the D string there kind of deal. But you get the point, is essentially once you sort of see these very simplistic movements by just moving a finger here and there, you can either do it diatonically, like we were doing it. You can do it in like a chain where we're using, you know, and then, of course, again, there's the 6. Jumping up again, nails it, right? So that right there, I'm not going to go too deep into it, but you get the point. Once you start to piece them together using the diatonic scale, using just a simple movement related to just the notes of the scale. So you're like, and also, the octave here, right? Oh, sorry, that's the 7th. My bad. I'm just getting too used to the dominant 7th stuff here. So there's your major 7th, obviously, and the 2nd. You know, that's why we're like skipping over the 2nds and the 7ths, because just on their own, you need to approach that with a bit more caution. But of course, fire up the pedal tone. And get going with making these strings, if you will, of using the power chord. And here's a great tip. Obviously, just pick the diatonic chords, right? There's G right there, right? When you're doing the E. Then you're going to go down a half step. So you have that whole sequence there of notes in the key of G major, obviously, right? So you can then use that to your advantage. And if you get real brave, you can then expand so that you're going to jump over the A string and now play the power chords on the D and the G string, right? Again, based on them in terms of the scale. So you're like, so there's the first one. Right there, you're like, you can keep going. Remember the augmentation there on the 4th degree. So now you're off to the races. Let's look at the more challenging version where we start getting into the Steve Vai type style and Van Halen stuff. All right, part 2 here, I'm going to keep relatively simple because I don't want this to get crazy. So imagine we're still working in G major here. I've got this E-type chord. Okay, well, normally if I want to play a triad, I have to go to the G-type in the open position here, right? Which means I have the next inversions here. And that right there is literally the most important thing you should take away from this section. Most of the time when you hear somebody start in a chord like this with a big power chord and they go to the next one, it's the inversion or the next inversion, if you will, or some other one. Obviously, you've got this, and then you could jump up to another caged chord type situation at just a different configuration. That's another big one, right? Where you get a different like order. In this case, it's 1-5-1. But once I get here, it's 1-3-5. That's a different sounding chord. There's more tension in this than there is in this. This is more stable, if you will, because there's just one less note to sort of clash with the perfect interval, and really you're doubling up on the root there, which really drives it home, right? So that's kind of a big one right there. It's just moving between them type situation. You're like, oh, there's the G there, so I can move to this one and play that one. Again, another inversion. That right there is one of the most important things to actually learn when it comes to rhythm guitar. is just quickly moving from one chord to the next. And of course, you have 4 flavors of those chords: major, minor, diminished, and augmented. Now listen, you can kind of skip over the augmented one at the beginning, but it should be incorporated in there. But major, minor, and diminished have to be like absolute, because of course that's going to show up in a major scale every single time. You're not going to run into augmented until you start getting into, you know, the harmonic minor and stuff like that. But having said that, it's an incredibly important sound, and if you listen to bands like the Beatles and whatnot, they use it incredibly effectively too. It's a great chord, it's a great sound, and it can be used very creatively to sort of set up the next little section of your music, because it's, you know, it's just cool. It's new, it's different, and not a lot of people use it. So food for thought. But essentially that's step number 1 right there, is just the idea that you're going to be starting here. And this one, you're like, I got this, right? Sort of configuration. Then you're going to start here. And of course you're going to get it again, right? Because there's my G up here, you know what I mean? Way up here. So I've got this is the same one that I just did there, right? It's just an octave higher now on the A string. And again, I'm basing it off the idea that I can see this G type chord, the same one that you would play like this, but imagine I'm now barring my fingers like that, if you will, or maybe like this is more accurate when I'm doing it up here. I'm sort of seeing this sort of configuration, of course, and the only reason I'm not doing the highest ones is because my fingers just can't. So I'm concentrating on the low ones, because those intervals and the inversions and whatnot are going to be the cannon fodder, if you will, to then do the same thing that we were doing with the power chords. So obviously, if you can't get there, you're in trouble, right? And that's a bit of an issue, is people want to sort of like really ramp up. And of course, you can do it with all the different chords. If I have this one, I can move up to the minor third, and then, of course, do another variation of that using the minor chord kind of situation. So it's not just relative to the major caged chords, it's all of them. So, of course, minor is going to have the 3 inversions. You're going to have more of those tools. Diminished will have one sound, but a couple different configurations. So, you figure that one out on your own, right? So that's going to be the first one, is you're like, you know where I'm doing it here on the A? Which is, you know, that's Stones, that's a trillion classic rock bands. But then you can take it, again, using the notes of the scale. So if I took this one here where I'm playing this D, the thing is what scale am I playing in there? Well, you're like, that's Dorian. So those are the notes I have, right? So when I'm playing this, I can now sneak up here to the higher note. Right, so I can now get that into the chord. And this is a big one too, because obviously you can start doing whole sequences like that, where you start here, you're like, I need to move up this major third here, this 2 frets like that, right? And the next one, because that would be, of course, from the Lydian position, right? Right, so I get it. This is why this is a lot more challenging now, because you have to be able to see 2 systems simultaneously on the neck. Basically, the inversions, right? You're like, there's this one, I can move up. Then the scales, you're like, there's the next one kind of deal, right? And then, of course, you're going to be sort of like, starting to combine the idea of the power chords and the other ones together, right? So that's about as far as I really want to take this, because you can take it to the nth degree, and I don't want to muddy up the water, if you will, make this a 50-minute video. Instead, what you should do is be like, okay, let's say I want to take a basic chord here, like D major, but I want to do it now from the D, the G, and the B string, right? So I've got this chord. Where's the next chord that's going to sound good, right? Right there. Right, if you're doing the open A. That's a classic, right? And so on and so forth, right? You've got this E, the G here, right? So again, you can be like, there's another one where you're, right? You could be here, sort of thing. So there are literally a trillion different sort of combinations that you can do, and it really depends on what the song requires, or if you're playing along to a backing track, or preferably real music, right? It's great to sort of get a song that goes, because then what you can do is basically start moving in with the interval structures. And then, of course, once you get those down, or sorry, the new caged chords, right? So instead of doing this D, you might play this E type here, right? The A type, I should say. Sorry, my bad. This is E and then the A type chord. Wow. Maybe next time you're going to be like, oh, well, I don't want to do that one. I'm going to move it up a whole step here kind of situation so I can get this E right here, right? So there's the D. Obviously, if I move up again, one more, the E. Right? So I've got this one, I've got this one here, right? So you might be like, oh, there's another E up here kind of thing. Like that. And then you start to substitute that in. There's the E, of course. You're going to move down to the D type situation. And this, and of course, this would actually be minor. Don't forget that one if you're doing it in G. Right? So you kind of got to pair up the diatonic stuff, but that is the next level. Essentially, you start to use the inversions of the power chord that you're working on. So if this is supposed to be, you know, the E major, we'll keep it simple with that one. You know, as the caged chord, not the actual one. Obviously, E major is way up here, but as the caged version, the E type that's as a major, and I'm playing it here in G. Right, I need to know the next one's going to be this one here, obviously. At the next inversion, right? Then moving up again. And you're like, okay, well, if I'm... Right? You see what I'm saying? It all starts to blend together. And then, of course, all you're going to do after that is just sort of add notes. It's almost exactly the same as just doing the power chords. Right? You're like... This way you can go between a G type idea, right, to the pedal tone being on the E. So that's another great way of looking at this, is all of a sudden you're like, okay, that's very handy, right? Bottom line. So you're like, yeah, I can start dancing between these things. And it's after you kind of do it in a sort of like very basic sort of arrangement, look to form more complex ideas by just moving some of these simple chord shapes somewhere else. And of course, at the very end, you're going to pair it all up. You're like here, starting here. And then you're going to move to maybe the B. And use the augmentation there using the power chord method to get the whole idea, right? So you're like, there's the 9, right? And then you can move to the B. That's basically the same idea that they use on Every Breath You Take by The Police. I know. See, once you start to see these basic ideas, you can expand on them and get the same kind of vibe that they got, but using, you know, a completely different sort of musical context rather than doing a bunch of arpeggiated 9 chords. You can just use some basic sort of power chords and variations on them, and then boom, insta song. And it takes the sort of simplicity of this sort of chord. And then you're going to move to the B, right? It just doesn't sound the best. Or maybe from here to the E. Not exactly interesting stuff, you know what I mean? So here, this kind of adds this. And then you can jump into the... And then you're like D. To the C kind of deal, right? So... It just opens up so many doors. I hope this lesson helped to a certain degree. I know I kind of whipped through it there, but just remember, start slow, work it into your practice sessions, spend 5 or 10 minutes of your practice session just kind of running through this stuff, And if you want to take it to a sort of higher level, start studying obviously a lot of the 80s metal and whatnot, Doc in Tooth and Nail, the Rat, Out of the Cellar, or there's lots of albums in there, obviously, and a whole bunch of other ones. Early Great White is another big one. Poison's another one, right? Warrant is another one. And you will have so many ideas. But of course, now armed with this knowledge, you know what's going on. So when you're like, oh, look, they're working in the key of A, you know, because they're doing this. The question is A major or A minor. And once you get that far, you're like, oh, they're either playing in C major, obviously, here at the 8th fret kind of deal. Or if you're like, oh, it's A major kind of deal, then of course you're going to be working in, yes, you tell me, F sharp minor, right? So there it is. That's a big one to sort of take away and tuck in your belt, if you will, instead of just sitting here endlessly playing scales and arpeggios. Start factoring in this to it too. And there you go. You get the full practice sort of session because you're doing the chords and the scales all at once. And maybe you're going to do it with arpeggios too. And of course you can start to arpeggiate these chords. You're like, and there it is. Now you have a whole new set of music. And then just work your way up to Van Halen level and Steve Vai. I'll see you in about 20 years. Thanks for joining me. Appreciate every single one of you. We'll see you in the next one.